Hello and welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining us today to this momentous event. I would like at the very beginning to thank Professor Noam Chomsky for agreeing to talk to us today and to speak to us and answer our questions. We received tremendous amount of questions. We received more than 180 questions, and I would like to apologize to some of you that we are not going to be able to ask all of these questions. But I selected a few of them that I think would be interesting, and I hope that Professor Chomsky finds them interesting as well. Professor Chomsky, the first question is, what do you think is the most underrated linguistic argument or theory nowadays?
Well, I think the most interesting linguistic argument is the first real, genuine explanation that we have for a deep fundamental property of language. And I think that's quite underappreciated. The property that I have in mind is what is technically called structure dependence. The roles and operations of language operate on abstract structures. They disregard linear order of expressions. I could give examples. And that's universal, ubiquitous, known to children without any information. They know it as early as you can test, 17, 18 months. And it's a pretty remarkable phenomenon. It means that children are ignoring 100% of what they hear and attending only to what they never hear, abstract structures constructed by their minds. And we actually have an explanation for it, a deep explanation. It derives from what's called the strong minimalist thesis, the assumption that language basically is perfect, that it uses the simplest possible computational operations. And from that, it's easy to show that you get structure dependence. Now it overturns all sorts of views about not just language, but learning, acquisition, behavior, everything, very wide-ranging consequences. And it is, I think, the first real explanation of deep linguistic properties. So I think it's, in many ways, the most important result of modern linguistics, but barely understood.
And why do you think this is the case? Why it's underappreciated? Why do you think that universal grammar, do you think it still has the same impact as perhaps 20 or 30 years ago?
Why is it misunderstood?
Yes.
I think the grip of basically behaviorist ideas is so powerful that it's very hard for people to break from it. So, for example, there's a huge literature in the cognitive sciences trying to show that this property of language, which children know without evidence, could be learned by massive statistical analysis of huge amounts of data. The efforts all fail demonstrably, but what's interesting is that they're undertaken. Why are they undertaken? We already have a perfect explanation, and the best possible one. It's the one that comes from the null hypothesis, no assumptions. And the efforts to show that it could be learned are totally missing the point. Even if you could show this, which they never will, it's the wrong question. The question is why children don't use 100% of what they hear. Even if you could show massive statistical analysis yields this doesn't answer the question. But it's just the idea. Well, in the 20th century, the assumption about language, the basic assumption was formulated by Leonard Bloomfield, for example. Language is a matter of habit and training. In philosophy of language, people like W.V. Quine, Wittgenstein, language is a matter of training, conditioning, complex of dispositions to respond. In the computational cognitive sciences, it's just taken for granted. That's what all the deep learning approaches are about. All of them totally false. None of them answer the question that all science is directed to. Why are things not some other way? Doesn't, even if you could show that something works this way, question is why this way and not some other way? It's just the wrong question. Well, it's very striking that if you look at the history of linguistics, from classical Greece to classical India, millennia ago, until the 20th century, it was pretty much taken for granted that language is a system of thought. It's language is what generates thought. Thought is what is generated by language. 20th century was a break. The behaviorist movements abandoned that and said, no, language is a matter of communication learned by training and habit. European structuralism based on the Saussurean concept that language is some kind of social contract. It's and it's a sharp break with the tradition. And I think it was a mistaken one. I think we're learning, I think, that we should pretty much go back to the basic insights of the millennia-old tradition, which I think was on the right track.
Yes, and that's why you contest the idea that, or you think that one of the most misconceptions about language is that language is a means of communication. You think it is a way to construct thoughts rather than communication.
Well, you're asking about language as communication versus language as a means of constructing thought.
Yeah, I mean, what is the difference and why such a view is very popular?
Yeah, they're radically different. So when if you introspect, almost your entire use of language is constructing thoughts. Occasionally, you externalize these thoughts, sometimes for the purpose of communication, often not. So if you're waiting for a bus and somebody's standing next to you, and when just for normal reasons of social interchange, you start talking about the weather, that's not communication. That's just social interaction. A very small part of the use of language, probably tiny statistically, is an effort to communicate. Communication has been selected. It's now a dogma in most of these fields that language is a means of communication. Well, that's the behaviorist influence. There must be also a misunderstood Darwinism. Must have some function for, preserving reproductive capacity or something. It's just not true. That's 20th century dogma. Facts are overwhelmingly against it. When we look at the structure of language, that's where the real interest is. We find that the basic design of language it seeks computational efficiency and does not care about communicative efficiency. could go through details, but there are many cases where there's a conflict between computational and communicative efficiency. Language picks computational efficiency all the time. I mean, take a simple example is anybody who's worked on automatic parsing or simply on perception of language knows that the major problem that you face is what's called filler gap problems. You hear a question word like which book at the front of a sentence. You have to find the gap where it belongs and where it gets interpreted. So which book did you tell the people to read, let's say? You have to find out where it is. That turns out to be a very hard task. Now, there's very strong evidence that what goes on in your mind has no gap. The gap comes because of reasons of computational efficiency. It's more efficient for the computational procedures of the brain to eliminate things that can be reconstructed. You don't need the internal planning, you don't need the articulatory mechanisms, vast savings. So there's a general simplicity principle which says wipe out everything but the one case which will show that the operation took place. Can't eliminate all of them, but you have to leave one. Well, that leads to communicative inefficiency. If the gap were filled, parsing would be simple, but nature doesn't care. Nature doesn't care about the function of things. The way evolution works, just think about evolution for a minute. Basically goes through 3 stages. Some disruption takes place, maybe a mutation, gene transfer, symbiosis, bacterium swallows another microorganism. Then you get a new system. Then comes the interesting part of evolution. Nature tries to find the simplest solution for this new system. Doesn't think about functions, just tries to find the simplest solution. Then comes the 3rd stage. It's kind of winnowing those organisms with greater reproductive capacity tend to dominate. That's natural selection. The crucial stage is the 2nd, reconstructing the simplest system from whatever arose. And apparently that's the way language worked. Some disruption created the capacity for recursive enumeration. Nature came along, found the simplest system. One of its consequences is deletion of repetitions. Happens to be bad for communication, but that's not nature's business. Incidentally, in the case of language, it seems that the 3rd stage was never reached. There apparently was no effective natural selection. The reason for believing that is that, as far as we know, the language faculty is uniform among all cultures, all societies. So you take an infant from a Papua New Guinea tribe that hasn't had other human contact for tens of thousands of years and bring it to London, let's say, go to Oxford and become a quantum physicist. No different. And conversely, as far as we know, there's just no difference, which isn't terribly surprising because humans are a very young species, but very recently appeared. But that seems the general course of evolution. As far as we know, language conforms to it. But one result is that communicative efficiency is just not a factor in language design. It is a factor in language use. That's a different matter, but not in language design.
I see. Um, okay, in similar vein, you have often suggested that children acquire grammatical system of enormous complexity rapidly and effortlessly on the basis of a very little evidence and by mere exposure. That's to say, without explicit teaching. Um, However, children, they get vast amounts of language experience. If we make a conservative estimate, if we assume that language acquisition begins at the age of 1, and the studies demonstrated that it begins even before the age of 1 and ends at the age of 5, and that children are exposed to language for maybe 8 hours a day. So they get roughly 1,100,000 hours of exposure at 3,600 input words per hour. And that's according to the average number of words heard by the children in Manchester Corpus. This amounts to over 42 million words over
Actually, that's the idea that children get vast amounts of language experience is a fantasy. There have been by now careful statistical analyses. Charles Yang is the main one who's done it, of all of the material presented to children. And it's astonishingly slim. Yes, there are millions of words, but most of them appear once. If you take a look at, if you account for what's called Zipf's law, the rank frequency distribution, which basically says that very short words appear over and over, other words less and less. There's a curve that's fitted by all use. Turns out that even bigrams, let alone trigrams, are very rarely heard in a child's corpus. So in fact, the idea that the material available to children is extremely sparse, has almost no data concerning what they actually know. In cases like structure dependence, the data is zero. You have no evidence whatsoever, none, that rules observe structure. This is even true for single word learning. So Lila Gleitman's work in particular showed that children acquire words with their complex meanings on 2 or 3 presentations, not the beginning of an inductive basis. This fantasy about great amounts of evidence, first of all, is false. And notice that it's also meaningless. Let's suppose you had tons of evidence. How do you get to the conclusion from them? How? What's the inductive procedure? Nobody's ever any suggestion whatsoever. So the fact is, first, the evidence is extremely sparse. And secondly, the idea that you pick it up from experience is just hand waving. How do you do it?
But how about Sachs et al. 1981, et al. 1981 studies of hearing children of deaf parents?
Yeah, that's a child alone is very unlikely to acquire language. There's not enough interaction and stimulation. But there are by now a fair number of cases of deaf children whose parents were indoctrinated into the oralist tradition. You're not supposed to gesture to children. They're supposed to learn to lip read. So the parents were very careful not to gesture, and the children saw very little gesturing. Of course, they couldn't hear. Children were playing together. Turns out that quite consistently, they developed their own language, a sign language. And as soon as it's discovered, of course, there's external intervention. So these experiments don't go on very long. But at the point where they're discovered, they have pretty much the characteristics of normal language. So it looks as though if you put 2 or 3 children together, let them just interact, the innate linguistic capacity will just flourish, and they'll develop a normal language. There's over time, there have been studies like Nicaraguan sign language, for example, where the first generation was deaf people from different linguistic backgrounds. They developed a kind of pidgin, but after about a generation or two, it was normal language. It's just, it just grows from the inside. Of course, like any innate capacity, it has to be triggered. Take vision. I mean, a lot is known about vision from intrusive experimentation with other animals, but the mammalian visual system just doesn't function unless there's early intervention with pattern stimulation. Otherwise, just degenerates. It's probably true of the linguistic system too. You can't experiment on it with humans, but it's a plausible conclusion from the kind of data that you're mentioning.
Okay, let's move on to question number 6, if you can see my screen.
6.
Yes. So is it possible to consider linguistics as a part of natural sciences like biology?
It's not only possible, but I think it's the only serious way to do it. I mean, it's a property of me that I speak a certain variety of English, not a certain variety of Arabic. That's something about me, like the fact that I have a certain height, or that my visual system works in a particular way and not some other way. That's a biological property. So anything you want to know about language, how it's acquired, how it evolved, how it's used, we'll have to start with some understanding of the nature of the system, which is internal to me, and not just me, the body, but certain parts of it. Like if my arm is amputated, I'll still speak English. If my brain is amputated, I won't. So it's obviously localized, and more localized than that by now, a fair amount is known. So it's a property that's coded somehow in specific parts of the brain. And that's by definition a biological property. So it seems to me any serious investigation will have to at least start with that.
So in similar vein, question number 18, the Quran talks, so this is one of the most frequent questions that participants wanted me to ask you. The Quran talks about the origin of human language in the verse at the very beginning of the Quran, that God taught Adam the names of all the things. Now, I know your position on religion, but what do you think of this? I mean, have you come across this verse before? Do you think it's similar to your theory of universal grammar, or that there is a language acquisition device in the brain?
Personally, I would take that to be a poetic rendition of something which is quite profound, that we have learned in the recent study of language acquisition. Again, this is primarily the work of the late Lila Gleitman, who I mentioned before. She and her students established quite firmly that words are learned with almost no exposure. Couple of presentations, child immediately picks up the word. Picking up a word is not a simple matter. If you start looking at the meaning of even the simplest words, turns out they are very complex, much more than you see in a dictionary. A dictionary just gives hints. Dictionary presupposes that you're an intelligent person who has all the information in your head. So take the earliest example studied back to classical Greece. Aristotle, for example, asked, what's the meaning of the word house? He actually put it a little bit differently. He said, what is a house? It was metaphysics, but it's basically no difference because he assumed plausibly that the symbols in the mind are basically the reflection of the entities in the world as we conceive them. It's our conception of the world. So we can fairly reinterpret him as asking, what's the meaning of the word house? Well, he made some interesting comments about that. In his metaphysical framework, house consisted of both form and matter and form. The matter of a house is the bricks, the timbers, the physical objects it's constituted of. The form of the house is our conception of it, the purpose of its design, what was in the mind of the architect, how it's regularly used, and so on. So something could look exactly like a house and not be a house at all. Could be a stable, a library, a paperweight for a giant. It could be almost anything. It's because we conceive of it and construct it in a certain way that it becomes a house. Well, all that's in the mind. If a physicist is trying to figure out what the meaning of the house is, they'll never find out, because the meaning of the house is fundamentally what Aristotle called its form, or mental constructions. Well, this is universal. It's not English, every language, one form or another. It gets much more complex than that. So, for example, if I say, I painted the house brown, it means I painted the outside brown. I could say, I painted the house brown on the inside. That's what's called the marked form, but you have to mark it. On the other hand, the house is not just the outside. If I say I'm near the house, I can't be inside it and near the exterior. I have to be outside it. Well, it goes on like this when you pursue it. Point is, all of this, none of this is presented in a dictionary, of course, just taken for granted. But all of this is acquired by the child on the basis of essentially no evidence. And that means it's somehow coming from the inside. Well, going back to the verse in the Quran, I think we can say that as I said, a poetic rendition of the idea that something's coming from the inside, not from experience. Then we can ask what it is. Actually, biology tells us almost nothing. We don't know anything about how deep instinctive properties are developed.
Great, thank you very much. Question 11. We see in the recent years the attempt to install microchips in apes and monkeys, and actually it's Elon Musk's ideas, to enable them to perform certain activities. Though unsuccessful, what would you say would be the ultimate obstacles for a non-human to learn to use language? Or is it possible to expand the human brain to learn maybe multiple languages?
This is 11.
Yes.
Number 11.
Yes.
It's a total waste of time. I mean, you can never show that something's impossible, but there isn't the slightest reason to believe that there could be any possible success in this. In fact, we might ask a simpler question. What about installing microchips in a human brain, which would enable a human to do what an ant can do, I live in the desert. In my backyard, there are ants. They have minuscule brains, tiny brain, barely see it with a microscope. They can carry out cognitive activities that humans can't carry out. They can navigate using the position of the sun, and for example, in ways that humans can't do. So why not put a chip in the human brain to see if it becomes as smart as an ant? It's a total waste of time. We just don't have that capacity. You have to have a different brain. And the same in the case of language. Actually, I should say this. So as far as we know, the particular properties of language, fundamental properties, are simply a species property, unique to humans. There's no analog to them in the rest of the organic world, which shouldn't come as a great surprise to us. Same is true of other organisms. Humans can't navigate the way ants do. They can't communicate the way bees do. It would be crazy to try to teach graduate students the waggle dance of bees, a total waste of time. You maybe could make them do something similar, but be complete nonsense. It's about as stupid as trying to teach a chimpanzee language. It's about the same kind of stupidity. I mean, we're just different organisms. We have our own capacities, depends on how our brain is constructed. So I don't think there's any hope in the imaginable future for anything of the kind to take place.
Okay, how about question 15? Do you think it is important for language teachers to be linguistically informed, to have a view of what language is and how it should be taught, rather than having knowledge about activities and techniques? I mean, you were once a teacher.
It's a little bit like asking whether a swimming teacher should learn something about human biology. It would certainly help them. I mean, yes, you can learn the techniques about how you put one arm over another arm, but you do much better if you base it on an understanding of human biology. Trainers of athletes take this for granted. You have to do, by now, a quite sophisticated study of the nature of the human organism to train a first-class athlete. And the same is true of somebody who does physical therapy. I mean, at my age, 94, you have a lot of problems getting around, balance, so on. And there are physical therapists who help with this, but if they want to do their work properly, they're going to have to understand something about human biology. And I don't see why language teaching should be any different. Understand the nature of language, you can do a better job.
That's good. Okay, question number 17. In one of my conversations with some corpus linguists, they have the impression that you don't like what they do. Is that true? And this is followed by comments you made recently and in the 50s.
Well, I have made critical comments in certain contexts. So if you're trying to find out how a language works, you can do a lot better with field methods. Go out into the field, find informants, use field methods to investigate what they know, what they don't know. Every field worker knows this. If you don't have any informants, okay, use a text. That's the worst case, but that's not a criticism of corpus linguistics. You can do a lot of things with corpus linguistics. In fact, I do it all the time myself. Now it's easier because you have Google search, so you can search an extraordinary corpus. So just to give one example, a very recent one, I'm quite interested in an interesting fact about discussion in the West about the invasion of Ukraine. It's considered a rule, a requirement, that you refer to it as the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. It's kind of interesting. Why do you have to say that? So I did a Google search, millions of hits for unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Then I did a comparable one, unprovoked invasion of Iraq, almost nothing, a couple of cases. Well, that tells any sane person that the invasion of Ukraine was provoked, and the invasion of Iraq was unprovoked. That's why it's necessary to emphasize what's not true. And in fact, if you look at the facts, that's correct. The invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked. Invasion of Ukraine, it's not justified, but it's certainly provoked. The evidence is overwhelming. But if that's so, what corpus linguistics shows you in this case is the deep indoctrination of Western intellectuals. They're like robots, totally indoctrinated by the system of ideology and control. Well, that's an interesting result of corpus linguistics. You can do a lot of things like that. By looking at usage, you can learn quite a lot.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a very good example. Okay, so one of the questions also, question number 19, what's your position on learning more than one language simultaneously?
Where are we? Learning more than one language simultaneously?
Yes.
For children, it's not a problem. I mean, in many cultures, a child will learn 4 or 5 languages simultaneously. They don't even know they're talking different languages. This is the way you talk to your mother. This is the way you talk to your father. This is the way you talk to the children in the streets and so on. Actually, my oldest friend, closest friend for 70 years, a great linguist, Morris Halley, grew up in Latvia. He grew up speaking 5 languages. He told me once he didn't know there were different languages. When he was about 4 years old, it suddenly occurred to him, hey, these are different languages, but it's just, this is the way you talk to this person, that's the way you talk to that person. And with complete fluency, we don't know the limit, but as I say, 4 or 5 languages is not unusual. There are West African cultures where children, the way the extended families work, you just learn a lot of languages. So as far as we know, there's basically no barrier to it.
Okay. What observation, question 26, might you make about how has technology affected the human communication ability, perhaps even human nature itself, considering neuroplasticity?
26. What observations about technology and communication? Quite a few. When I communicate with my grandchildren with email, I have to do a lot of decoding. They use a lot of code words or abbreviations or all sorts of things which I'm totally unfamiliar with. And in fact, the nature of the use of language has been affected. It's there are a number of studies, I'm sure you know about this, that's showing that literacy has seriously declined. People don't read. Younger people don't read. I can even see this I've seen this over the years just in teaching. I've been teaching graduate school for 70 years, but you go back a number of years, it was possible to make simple literary references without explaining them. Everybody knew what you were talking about. By now, that's barely true. Not just in the United States, elsewhere. I remember giving a talk in Spain once to a group of a technical group, and I made some reference to the great classic Don Quixote. Nobody knew what I was talking about. I mean, and in fact, it's even true in the technical literature. Quite commonly, students don't know what was written 5 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. It's you just don't read. You look at the what's the draft that's up in a forthcoming publication. So, but I think it's had an effect, not a good effect.
Yeah, I had a similar story when I referred to 1984 to my students, and no one knew what 1994 is.
Somebody's bringing up a similar story about referring to 1984 to my students. They didn't know what it was.
No, no. Okay. So let's go to more questions about language and the interconnection between language and morality. Question 32, 33, and 34, maybe, if you can read them.
These are very interesting questions. They weren't asked until pretty recently. The real breakthrough in this area was work by a philosophy student, John Mikhail. He's now a law professor at Georgetown, got his PhD in philosophy. He was working on, he started by working on Rawls's famous theory of justice. He discovered what is correct, that in his original work back in the 1960s, Rawls was using a linguistic model, a generative grammar model for trying to develop a theory of justice. Actually, I knew him at the time, and we were talking a lot about this. He took it out of his book because philosophers hated it so much. He didn't want to get off on a sidetrack, so he put it to the side. But Mikhail picked it up, refuted the objections to it, went on to develop it, and came up with the idea that there is something like an innate grammar underlying moral judgment, which is universal. It's part of our nature. And he started even doing some empirical experiments about this with some psycholinguists, Elizabeth Spelke, fine cognitive psychologist. This work was then picked up by others, especially Mark Hauser, cognitive neuroscientist, comparative biologist, who's done a fair amount of work on different cultures, children, seeing, investigating what amount to innate moral judgments. And there's a lot of uniformity and internal structure, which makes it seem possible that there might be something like what's postulated in these questions, some kind of innate grammar of the kind that Rawls was toying with and that John Mikhail then developed. So maybe there is. I think it's a very interesting topic for the future.
Yeah, I'm doing something. I'm working on morality and language, actually. Question 37. So in the same vein, can human children create moralities out of the data coming from their moral environments or out of the raw materials of pigeon-like proto-moralities?
That's a very natural question. It's barely been explored, but it would be plausible to expect that you might discover something like that. The work of Mark Hauser that I mentioned tends in that direction, but this is all very preliminary. There's only a few people trying to work on it very recently. So it's an area that could be quite rich and important, could have many consequences.
Okay, let me write down the question. So, which is grammatically, just a second, which is grammatically correct? Is she or it is her? So, which is grammatically correct?
That's an interesting question. In normal English, you use the accusative case as the what's called the null form if there's no reason. So you say it's me, not it is I. Well, there's a tradition among formal grammarians that English is supposed to be like Latin. So children are indoctrinated to say, it is I. That's not normal English. If you just look at children in the streets, they'll say it's me. They'll say things like, him and me were here. But then the teacher tells you, no, you're not allowed to say that. English is really Latin. So you're supposed to say he and I are here. It causes a lot of confusion because it's just a distortion of the normal language. So you hear people say things like, between you and I, they're overgeneralizing. Since the rule is totally artificial, they don't really know how it works, and they overuse it. There's a famous case why grammarians who didn't understand the language have caused lots of problems with the teaching and usage. But there are a number of cases like that. In fact, if something is taught in schools, it's probably wrong. The language itself, you don't have to teach. Children know it, you know. If you're teaching something, chances are it's an artificial distortion of some kind.
Okay, I'm going to type the next question in the chat. So one of the questions, what was the first spoken language on Earth?
What was the first spoken language on Earth? Nothing like anything now, but there's no possible way to know. In fact, probably it's meaningless. We have some guesses as to roughly when this took place, but it wasn't suddenly a whole language came out. You know, you can only speculate, but the guesses are that there were something when the capacity for language emerged, and it had to emerge suddenly. That's a matter of logic. The essence of language is that it has an infinite number of structured expressions, each of which expresses a thought. It's not language, but something that means that there's a finite procedure coded in your brain that yields an infinite number of structures that has to appear instantaneously. You can't build up to infinity. It's like the number system. You can't, it's just as hard to go from 7 to unbounded as from 0 to unbounded. So it's not that you learn small numbers and then you keep building them up. That's impossible. At some point, there has to be a change which says it goes on indefinitely. Once you get that, you have an infinite set. Well, so that means that at some point in some individual, because these things happen to a person, this thing came along, spread to many individuals, maybe inherited, got to a point where you could link it to conceptual systems, maybe primitive conceptual systems like actor, agent, and things like that. And at some point you have the rudiments of language, then it just explodes. Like we see with things like Nicaraguan Sign Language. After, in a very short time, with very little exposure, it blossoms into a full-fledged language. Well, presumably that happened somewhere around 200,000 years ago, but you can't find out.
Okay, next question in the chat. How far has the language acquisition theories evolved? How did this evolution affected Noam Chomsky's main theory of language acquisition? Did Noam Chomsky change his prospect about language acquisition throughout the years?
Yeah, very greatly. And you can trace it in the literature.
Yeah.
Back to the early 1950s, it was understood that what's called poverty of stimulus is a very serious problem. The standard views about habit, training, conditioning, none of them get anywhere, nowhere. I mean, you have to throw them all out because what's acquired is obviously far beyond any evidence. Well, it was also sort of understood at the time, remember, it was believed that languages could vary arbitrarily. Almost anything could be a language. That was standard doctrine. Didn't seem very plausible. But though the few of us who were interested in the topic, very few, handful of people, talked about it, but didn't seem to be anywhere to go with it. If you look at my book, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, it's 1965, there's a sentence in it which was considered almost outrageous. The sentence was something like, instead of assuming that language derives from a couple of years of experience, could be that much of it comes from millions of years of evolution. Now it's considered totally outrageous, can't even discuss it. Well, by now we know it's wrong. It's not a couple of million years. It's probably a couple of thousand years.
Very recent.
So what seemed outrageous then was nowhere near the truth. Recent work has shown what we've talked about, that language is acquired on virtually no data, sometimes zero data, basic principles. And it's also hasn't been shown, really, we don't know enough, but evidence is tending toward the conclusion that language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens. And that's around 200,000 to 300,000 years, which is nothing in evolutionary time. If you look before the appearance of Homo sapiens, there's almost no evidence in the archaeological record for any symbolic activity. Maybe a mark on a bone or something like that, but nothing of any richness or complexity. Well, there's now genomic evidence that's pretty solid that humans began to separate maybe on the order of about 150,000 years ago. Well, they all have the language faculty. So it would seem reasonable to assume that the language faculty developed in that small window between the emergence of Homo sapiens and the beginning of dispersal. In evolutionary time, that's very brief. Shortly after the dispersal of humans, you do get rich symbolic activity. Things like the marvelous cave paintings and things like that. Complex, evidence of complex social life and so on. So the evidence sort of converges to strongly suggest that language appeared very quickly in evolutionary time and pretty much the way it is now. No indication that it's changed. The externalization of language, speech, gesture, those systems were around long before language appeared. I mean, and have not been affected by language. There's no indication that it. So the language is some internal system which arose pretty suddenly, seems to be a system of thought. At some point it became externalized in one or another way, usually sound, could be gesture, could even be touch. But, and that's where the complexity of language lies, it seems, in the externalization. But the internal system could turn out to be close to uniform. We're more and more finding that out. So languages which look on the surface to be radically different on deeper analysis turn out to have fundamentally the same kinds of properties. One person who's worked on that, who I see is here, is Per Picard. I don't see him, but I see his name, who's been working on Amazonian languages and finding that deep fundamental properties appear, which show up in different ways in different languages. And that's been the general course of work over the last 30 or 40 years. This was assumed to be obvious by, say, Aristotle, took for granted there's a fixed language of thought in your mind, and languages differ only in that they use different sounds to express the concepts. Something like that might turn out to be true. So yes, my own views of this have changed enormously.
Okay. Another question, again, in the chat. Do children learn from indirect negative evidence in a form of request or for clarification and adult reformulation of their utterances?
Well, there's quite a lot of study of this in the child language literature. And the general conclusion is children ignore instruction. In fact, they don't even pay much attention to what their parents are saying to them. They just pay attention to what's going on in the general environment. There's a lot of experimental work on this. It used to be thought at one point that there was a special way in which mothers talk to children, motherese it was sometimes called. And in fact, there is something like that. Almost instinctively, if you're talking to a young child, you use a higher pitch of your voice and say things simply. Turns out that may be good for the adult, but it doesn't seem to mean anything to the child, except maybe establishing some emotional relationship. But it looks as though what the child is doing is just picking up the ambient information, what's going on. A child wants to know what people are doing out there. And in fact, one result of this, which I'm sure you probably can verify from your own experience, is that the language we usually end up with is the language of our peers, not the language of our parents. So my parents were first-generation immigrants. I don't speak their language. I speak the language of the children in the streets in the North Philadelphia neighborhood where I grew up. That's pretty general.
Okay, before we end, what's your advice to young linguists?
What's my advice to young linguists?
Yes.
Follow your inclinations. What looks exciting to you, interesting, engages your imagination and your curiosity, pursue it. There's no general advice.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, for talking to us today. We come to the end of this session. We are very happy and we are very excited to have you and to have you here and to talk to us. Thank you very much. Any final comments before we end?
Just good luck in your work.
Thank you.
Lots of interesting, exciting questions arising, waiting for people with new ideas to deal with them, to show that we're all wrong. That would be the best thing.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Chomsky, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay, I would like to thank everyone participating today. Thank you very much, and I'm very sorry again for not being able to ask all of the questions. They are very interesting questions, and I would like to thank you again for sending them. Our next talk will be with Michael Tomasello. It's going to happen in August. I'm going to share the rest of details with you in the Facebook group page. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best of luck. Have a good one.